The alarm hit before I even reached the corridor. A low, pulsing red light that meant one thing on this station. The reactor shield was failing, and we had less than 20 minutes before the whole northern wing lost breathable air. I am Vera, and my sister Cell was 3 steps behind me, both of us running faster than our species was built to run, our long limbs slamming against handrails as the station tilted with every warning chime. We were not engineers. We were observers, sent by the assembly to study the one human aboard this outpost before the vote that would decide whether his entire species could join the Galactic Council. But observation meant nothing if there was no station left to observe from. "The core diagnostic says the coolant line was cut," Cell shouted over the noise, her voice sharp with panic she rarely allowed herself to show. "Cut, Vera. Not broken. Cut." That word landed harder than the alarm itself. Sabotage. On a station with only 4 crew members and 1 human, sabotage meant someone here wanted us to fail, and wanted it badly enough to risk all our lives to make it happen. We needed the one person on this station who understood the reactor systems better than anyone. We needed the human. His door was at the end of the last corridor, and I hit it without slowing down, without knocking, without any of the courtesy protocols we had followed for 11 quiet days of watching him work, eat, and sleep like any ordinary member of a crew. There was no time for courtesy now. The door slid open and I froze for half a second, because what I saw was not what I expected. He was on the floor, not injured, not unconscious, but kneeling in front of a narrow strip of photographs taped to the wall, 7 faces staring back at him, a burned patch of fabric pinned beside them like a small flag. His name was Ethan, and in that moment he looked nothing like the calm, steady engineer we had been assigned to study. His eyes were wet. His shoulders were shaking. He was speaking quietly to the photographs, saying a name, then another, as if the people in those pictures could still hear him. "Ethan," I said, and he turned so fast his elbow struck the wall. For one heartbeat I thought we had broken something in him, walking in on a moment that clearly was not meant for us. But then something shifted in his face, a kind of hard, fast focus that replaced the grief almost instantly, like a switch had been thrown somewhere behind his eyes. "What's wrong?" he said, already standing, already moving toward the door. "The coolant line," Cell said. "Someone cut it. The reactor shield drops in 19 minutes. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask why. He grabbed a tool case from beside his bed and was already moving past us into the corridor before I had finished explaining the readings on my handheld device. I had expected shock, or at least a pause, some sign that the emotional moment we had just witnessed would slow him down. Instead, he moved like a man who had trained his whole life for exactly this kind of emergency, his breathing steady, his questions short and precise. "Which junction?" he asked. "Junction 4, near the lower ring," Cell answered, running to keep pace with him. "That's not an accident spot. Nobody walks past Junction 4 unless they mean to." His jaw tightened, but his hands stayed steady on the case strap. "Somebody wanted this to look like our systems are unreliable. Somebody wanted the timing to matter." I did not understand what he meant yet, not fully, but I understood enough to feel a cold twist of worry settle into my chest. The vote to decide whether humanity would be allowed into the assembly was happening today, broadcast live to every member world. Time to conclude in less than 1 hour. If this station failed during that broadcast, if the human crew was seen struggling to survive a disaster on their own doorstep, it would confirm every fear the council delegates already carried about his species. It would not matter that the failure was caused by someone else's hand. It would only matter that it happened, and that it happened now. We reached the lower ring in under 3 minutes, moving through narrow service corridors that smelled of hot metal and recycled air. The warning lights had turned from red to a deeper amber, a sign the shield integrity had dropped further while we ran. Cell kept glancing at her handheld, calling out numbers, and each one was worse than the last. 15 minutes, she said. Then the reactor auto-vents to protect the core. Everyone in this wing needs a suit or a sealed room before that happens. Then we don't have 15 minutes, Ethan said. We have maybe 10 before I need to start sealing people in instead of fixing anything. He dropped to his knees in front of a panel covered in dust and old warning stickers, popped it open with a single practiced motion, and pulled out a tangle of wires and tubing that looked, to my untrained eyes, like the guts of some small mechanical animal. Cell crouched beside him, holding a light steady, and I stood watch at the corridor entrance, because someone needed to make sure whoever had done this did not come back to finish the job. "There," Ethan said, and for the first time his voice cracked slightly, not from fear, but from something closer to disbelief. "Look at this cut. It's clean. Whoever did this used a laser tool, not a broken part, not an accident. This is deliberate." Can you fix it? I asked from the doorway, trying to keep my voice level even though my hands were trembling against the frame. I can patch it. I can't replace the whole line in 10 minutes. He was already pulling equipment from his case, moving faster now, his hands steady despite what he had just confirmed. But a patch might hold long enough to keep the shield from failing during the vote broadcast. After that, we fix it properly. Cell looked at me, and I understood the question in her eyes without her needing to speak it. This was the moment the assembly delegates would be watching most closely, whether they admitted it or not. A species under pressure, facing a crisis with real consequences, reveals more truth about itself in 10 minutes than in 10 years of quiet observation. And what we were watching now was not the volatile, unstable creature described in 3 formal reports from 3 suspicious delegations. What we were watching was a man who had been crying on his floor 8 minutes earlier, now working with steady hands to save every life on this station, including ours. 8 minutes, Cell said quietly. Ethan did not answer. He was focused entirely on the wiring, his tongue between his teeth in concentration, murmuring numbers to himself as he worked. I noticed something strange in that silence, something I had not expected to notice in the middle of an emergency. He was not panicking. He was not even hurried in the reckless sense, the sense the reports warned us about. He was calm in a way that felt earned, like grief and pressure were not opposites for him but 2 things that lived side by side, each one making room for the other. A sound came from behind me, soft footsteps in the corridor, and I turned fast, my instincts sharpening. A figure stepped out from the shadow of the junction crossing, one of the station's other assigned crew, a delegate observer from a species called the Karashi, tall and thin with pale-plated skin, someone we had barely spoken to during our time here. His name was Draven, and the moment I saw his face, I understood something had gone deeply wrong. "You should not be down here," he said, his voice smooth in a way that did not match the tension in his shoulders. "Someone cut the coolant line," I said, watching him carefully. "We are trying to save this station." "A pity," he said, and something about the way he said it made my chest go cold. Perhaps the human species is simply not suited to the responsibilities the Assembly is considering. Perhaps this proves the point my delegation has been making for cycles. Cell's head snapped up from where she knelt beside Ethan. "You did this." Draven did not deny it. He did not need to. His silence was answer enough, and in that silence I understood the shape of everything that had happened over the past hour. His delegation had opposed human membership from the very first hearing, citing fears about instability, about unpredictable emotion, about a species too dangerous to welcome into a peaceful community. If the vote failed today, his argument would be proven correct in the eyes of every watching world. And if it failed because a station under his watch collapsed during the broadcast, no one would ever trace the true cause back to him. "You would kill everyone on this station," I said, "just to win an argument." "I would prove a point," he said coldly. "Whether anyone survives to hear it is simply a variable." Ethan did not look up from his work, but his voice cut through the tension like a blade. 6 minutes. Somebody keep him talking, or get him out of my way, because either way, I'm not stopping. Cell moved first, faster than I expected, placing herself between Draven and the open panel. I stepped forward as well, and for a moment the 3 of us stood in a tense line while Ethan continued working behind us, his hands never slowing despite the danger standing only a few steps away. "You will not stop him," I said to Draven, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "You have already shown the Council everything they need to know about your species today. Sabotage, cowardice, a willingness to let innocent people suffer for the sake of a political outcome. If anyone fails the Assembly's standards, it will not be him." Draven's expression flickered, something between anger and calculation, and for a moment I thought he might do something worse, might try to finish what he started. But station security drones, alerted by Cell's earlier distress call, rounded the corner behind him, their lights flashing a warning pattern that even a hostile delegate could not ignore. He took 1 step back, his composure cracking at last. "This is not finished," he said, before the drones closed in and escorted him away, his threat hanging uselessly in the recycled air. 4 minutes, Ethan called out, and none of us had time to think about Draven anymore. I crouched beside him, watching his hands move with a precision that seemed almost impossible given everything that had just happened. The grief, the sabotage, the threat standing only meters away. He twisted 2 wires together, sealed them with a strip of silver tape, and pressed a small device against the joint that hummed briefly, before falling silent. "That's the patch," he said, sitting back on his heels, sweat on his forehead despite the cool air of the lower ring. "It should hold the shield stable for at least 6 hours. Long enough for a proper repair, long enough for the vote." Cell checked her handheld, and I watched her face carefully as the numbers scrolled past. For a long moment she said nothing, and my chest tightened with a fear I had not allowed myself to feel until now. The fear that we had come this close and still failed. Then she looked up, and something like relief broke across her face. Shield integrity climbing, 92% and rising. We did it. The three of us sat there for a moment in the narrow service corridor, none of us speaking, the amber warning lights slowly fading back to a calm blue along the walls. I realized my hands were still shaking, and when I looked at Ethan, I saw that his were too, though his voice had never wavered while he worked. "You knew," I said quietly. "You knew this could all be a trick to make your species look bad, and you fixed it anyway, even with him standing right there threatening us." Ethan wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and let out a long breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. Letting the station fail wouldn't have proven anything except that I'm the kind of person who lets people die to make a point. I'd rather lose the vote than become that. Cell and I exchanged a look, and I understood in that moment that we were both thinking the same thing, a thought that would shape the report we submitted only 20 minutes later, with barely enough time before the assembly broadcast reached its final vote. Every fear the council carried about humanity, every warning from delegations like Draven's, assumed that human emotion made them dangerous, that grief and pressure would combine into something explosive and unpredictable. What we had just watched proved the opposite. Ethan's grief had not weakened him during the crisis. It had made the stakes personal, made saving this station feel like honoring the people whose photographs still hung on his wall. His calm under pressure was not the absence of feeling. It was feeling with a purpose, feeling that had learned, through loss, exactly what mattered and what did not. We helped him carry his tools back through the corridor, the station humming quietly around us as its systems stabilized. The danger passed, but the memory of it still sharp in all three of us. As we walked, I found myself asking a question I had wanted to ask since the moment we had first walked into his room. "The photographs," I said carefully. "The people on your wall. Will you tell us about them, if you don't mind?" He was quiet for a few steps, and I worried I had overstepped some boundary I did not fully understand. But then he began to speak, softly, without the sharpness that had carried him through the emergency only minutes earlier. "My old crew," he said. 7 people. We were on a different station, years ago, when a reactor breach hit us with almost no warning. I was outside on a repair walk when it happened, couldn't get back in time to help." He paused, his eyes distant for a moment before returning to the present. "I talk to them sometimes, tell them what's still working, what I fixed, what I'm still trying to get right. It helps me remember that saving people isn't just a job, it's a promise I owe them, every single time." Cell walked in silence for a moment, and I could see the calculations behind her eyes shifting, the same shift I felt happening inside my own mind. Every report we had studied about humanity described their grief as a weakness, a crack in their psychology that made them unpredictable under stress. But what we had just witnessed was the opposite of a crack. It was a foundation. His grief did not break him during the emergency. It reminded him exactly why the emergency mattered. "We are recommending full membership," Cell said suddenly, and Ethan stopped walking, turning to look at her with an expression somewhere between surprise and disbelief. "You don't need to do that because of what happened today," he said. "I was just doing my job." "That is exactly why we are doing it," I said. "Because saving a station full of strangers, including 2 people from a species you barely know, was simply your job to you. Not heroism, not a performance for the cameras. Just the next necessary thing, done because it needed doing." He did not have a response to that, at least not immediately, and the 3 of us walked the rest of the way back to the command deck in a silence that felt, for the first time since we had arrived on this station, entirely comfortable. The broadcast concluded less than an hour later, and I watched from the observation platform as the final tally scrolled across the display. Delegation after delegation casting their vote, some in favor, a few opposed, until the total crossed the threshold required for approval. Humanity had been granted provisional membership in the assembly, the first new species admitted in over a decade. Draven's delegation was formally censured within the week, their sabotage attempt uncovered through station security records that even his careful planning had not fully erased. His species would spend years rebuilding the trust they had spent that single afternoon destroying, a consequence that felt, to me, entirely fair given what he had been willing to risk. Ethan stayed on the station for another 6 months after that, continuing his work, continuing his quiet conversations with the photographs on his wall, though I noticed he began leaving his door open more often after that day, as if some small part of him had decided there was no longer anything to hide. Cell and I visited often, not as observers filing reports anymore, but as something closer to friends, sharing meals, listening to his stories about the crew he had lost, and the strange, steady comfort he found in remembering them. I think back sometimes to that first moment, bursting through his door during an emergency, catching him in a private moment of grief that was never meant for outside eyes. It would have been easy to see only the tears, only the vulnerability, and assume it confirmed everything the skeptical delegations feared about his species. Instead, we saw what came after those tears, the focus, the steadiness, the quiet determination that let him carry both sorrow and duty in the same two hands, without ever setting either one down. That is the lesson I carry with me now. Long after the vote, long after the sabotage, long after the station itself was decommissioned and its crew reassigned to new postings across the galaxy. Grief and strength are not opposites. Sometimes the deepest grief is exactly what teaches a person how to hold steady when everything around them is falling apart, because they have already learned, through loss, precisely what is worth fighting to protect. I do not think Ethan ever fully understood how close his species came to being rejected that day, or how much of the final vote rested on 10 frantic minutes in a narrow service corridor, watched by two alien sisters who had walked in expecting nothing more than a quiet evening of observation. But I remember it clearly, every second of it, and I know now that what changed my mind about humanity was never a report, or a hearing, or a carefully worded argument from a council chamber. It was watching a grieving man wipe his eyes, stand up, and go straight to work saving people he barely knew, simply because it needed to be done.